The children who go missing in North American wilderness do not behave the way missing children are supposed to behave. This is the detail that sits at the center of the most disturbing subset of David Paulides' research. Not the distances, though the distances are impossible. Not the searched areas, though the searched areas should have found them. Not the dogs, though the dogs find nothing. It is the behavior, or rather the absence of it. When a small child becomes separated from their family in wilderness terrain, there is a predictable behavioral pattern that search and rescue professionals are trained around. The child stops moving when they are tired. They cry when they are frightened. They seek shelter instinctively. They move downhill toward water, following the path of least resistance. They do not make strategic navigation decisions. They do not travel efficiently. They do not cover the distances that adults cover. They are found when they are found quickly, close to where they were last seen. When they are not found quickly, they are found in the predictable directions, downhill, near water, in the shelter of natural features. This is the pattern. It is well documented. It is the foundation of lost person behavior modeling used by search and rescue agencies across the continent. The children in Paulides' Missing 411 research do not follow this pattern. They are found at distances they could not have traveled, at elevations they could not have reached, in directions that are not the predictable directions, in conditions that do not match the exposure time, in searched areas that should have found them before they were eventually found. The pattern of their disappearances and recovery does not match the pattern of children who get lost in the wilderness. It matches something else, something that the lost person behavior models do not have a category for, something that the agencies responsible for the wilderness have decided not to look at directly. This is the episode about the children, about what the cases show, about what the children who survived sometimes say about where they were, and about what the traditions that have lived longest with this land have always known about what happens to children in certain places. The statistical profile of child disappearances in Paulides' Missing 411 dataset differs from the general missing persons profile in ways that are consistent and specific. Children under 10 years old are overrepresented relative to their presence in the wilderness-using population. Not dramatically. This is not a pattern where children are disappearing at rates so far above expectation that the pattern is immediately visible in raw numbers. But when the cases with conventional explanations, drowning, exposure deaths, where the body is found quickly in a predictable location, lost hiker cases that resolve within hours, are separated from the anomalous cases, the proportion of young children in the anomalous category is elevated. This elevation is not uniform across age groups. It concentrates in the 2 to 6 age range. Children old enough to walk, but not old enough to navigate. Children who lack the developmental capacity to make the strategic decisions that would produce the distances and locations where they are eventually found. This is significant. If children were disappearing due to predation, the age distribution would be different. Large predators in North American wilderness, mountain lions, bears, take prey opportunistically and do not show the specific targeting of the 2 to 6 demographic. If children were disappearing due to drowning, the geographic distribution would be different, concentrating near water rather than the varied terrain configurations where the anomalous cases occur. The age concentration in the anomalous cases points towards something that specifically involves children in a developmental range defined by mobility without navigation capability. Children who can be moved but who cannot find their own way back. This is not a comforting observation. It is not one that any official agency has been willing to make publicly. But it is what the data examined honestly suggests. Something in the cluster zones has a specific relationship to children in a specific developmental range. What that relationship is, the data alone cannot answer, but it is consistent. And consistency, as has been said before in this series, is itself a form of evidence. The case of Alfred Beilhartz is the earliest in Paulides' dataset that exhibits the full cluster of anomalous characteristics. Alfred was 3 years old in August of 1938 when he disappeared from Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. He was with his family on a trail near Fall River. His parents were present. He was visible to them. They looked away for the time it takes to look away from a 3-year-old in a safe environment, seconds. When they looked back, he was gone. The search was immediate. His parents called out. Other hikers in the area joined the search. Park rangers were notified within minutes. The terrain around the last known location was covered quickly by multiple searches. Nothing was found. The search expanded over the following days. Hundreds of searches. Dogs. The specific terrain characteristics of the area, the river nearby, the trail configuration, the slope of the surrounding hillside, were all worked according to standard lost person search protocols. Nothing was found. Alfred was never found. He was 3 years old. He had been with his parents on a trail in a national park in broad daylight. He vanished in the time it takes to look away. And in the 86 years since, no physical evidence of what happened to him has been recovered. No remains, no clothing, no physical trace. Alfred Beilhartz simply stopped existing in any form that human investigation has been able to locate. This case is from 1938. The search technologies available were limited compared to what exists today. But the basic parameters of the search, dogs, organized ground coverage, experienced personnel, terrain appropriate to the missing person's capabilities, are not fundamentally different from what modern searches employ. And modern searches, with all of their technological advantages, have produced the same result in cases with the same characteristics. Nothing. The terrain was searched. The person was not there, and then was never found at all. The case of Jaryd Atadero is perhaps the most discussed in the missing 411 child disappearance literature, both because of the circumstances of his disappearance and because of what was found when physical evidence finally appeared years later. Jaryd was 3 years old on October 2nd, 1999, when he disappeared from the Big South Trail along the Cache La Poudre River in the Roosevelt National Forest in Colorado. He was with a group of adults from a Christian fellowship group that included his father, Jaryd Atadero. The group was hiking a moderate trail. Children were present. The adults were paying attention. Jaryd moved ahead of the group. Adults further along the trail called back that they had seen him. A small child in a bright jacket moving along the trail ahead of them. And then he was gone. The search that followed was extensive. Hundreds of volunteers, experienced trackers, dogs, aerial search with helicopters. The terrain in all directions from the point where Jaryd was last seen was covered methodically over multiple days. The dogs found nothing, no scent trail, no direction of travel. The search found nothing. Jaryd was declared legally dead in 2002, 3 years after his disappearance. His father, Alfred Atadero, continued searching. In June of 2003, nearly 4 years after Jaryd's disappearance, hikers on the Big South Trail found remains and clothing. The location was approximately 2 miles from where Jaryd was last seen, at a significant elevation above the trail. Terrain that a 3-year-old child could not have reached unassisted, and that by any standard lost person behavior model, a 3-year-old child would not have moved toward. The Big South Trail area had been searched. The specific area where the remains were found had been covered by searchers. It had not been found during those searches. What investigators found when they examined the clothing and remains was disturbing in ways that were not fully addressed in the official findings. Jaryd's shirt and pants were inside out. Both garments had been turned inside out in a way that is not produced by normal wear, by environmental exposure, or by animal predation. This is not how clothing ends up when a child wanders off a trail and dies of exposure. This is not what weather does to a child's clothing. This is not what scavengers do. The clothing had been deliberately turned inside out by something capable of deliberately turning clothing inside out. Jaryd's shoes were never found. The official determination was that Jaryd died of mountain lion predation and exposure. The inside-out clothing and the missing shoes were not addressed in the official finding. The location, in terrain, a 3-year-old could not have reached in an area that had been searched, was not addressed. Alfred Atadero has never accepted the official finding. He has continued seeking answers. He has not found them. The official case is closed. The clothing was inside out. The shoes are still missing. Those facts are in the record. They have not been explained. The condition of children found alive in anomalous missing cases is one of the most carefully documented and least discussed aspects of Paulides' research. In cases where young children are recovered alive after periods that should have produced significant physical deterioration, hypothermia, dehydration, injury from terrain exposure, the physical condition of the recovered child is sometimes inconsistent with what the elapsed time and exposure conditions would produce. Children found after 2 days in wilderness conditions, showing temperatures and weather patterns that should produce hypothermia, who do not exhibit hypothermia. Children missing for 24 or 36 hours, who, when found, are not as hungry or thirsty as they should be. Children whose physical condition suggests a shorter exposure period than the documented time of disappearance indicates. These findings are noted in case files. They are not in general followed up. The official explanation in these cases is typically resilience, the remarkable capacity of the human body, particularly in children, to withstand conditions that models would predict as fatal. This explanation is real. Children do survive conditions that models predict as unsurvivable. This accounts for some cases. It does not account for all of them. It does not account for the cases where the physical evidence is not simply at the survivable end of the normal distribution, but is inconsistent with the documented timeline in ways that suggest the exposure period was shorter than the documented missing period. If a child was missing for 40 hours and their physical condition suggests 12 hours of exposure, one of two things is true. Either the physical condition evidence is wrong, or the child was not exposed to wilderness conditions for 40 hours. The first possibility is the one that official findings default to. The second possibility, that the child was not in the wilderness during some portion of the documented missing period, is not a conclusion that any official investigation will state, but it is what the evidence, in some cases, actually suggests. Where was the child during the hours when they were not accumulating the physical evidence of exposure? This is the question that the children who survived sometimes answer, and their answers are the most difficult part of this research to engage with, honestly. The accounts that surviving children give of the missing period are, as noted in an earlier episode, consistently dismissed as childhood fantasy, post-traumatic confabulation, or the natural storytelling behavior of young children who lack the cognitive framework to accurately encode and retrieve memory of distressing events. This dismissal is not unreasonable as a default response. Children do confabulate. Memory formation and retrieval in young children is unreliable in ways that are well documented in developmental psychology. A 3-year-old's account of what happened to them over 2 days in the wilderness should be treated with appropriate skepticism. But the skepticism should be applied consistently. It should not be deployed selectively to eliminate evidence that conflicts with the preferred explanation while accepting evidence that supports it. The accounts of surviving children in anomalous missing cases share specific characteristics across cases involving children who could not have known each other, who disappeared in different states, in different years, in different park systems. Large, dark, warm, strong, carrying them, moving with them, keeping them warm. Not threatening, not frightening in the way that something threatening would be frightening. These descriptions are consistent across cases involving 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds, consistent in the specific details that a child's vocabulary and developmental capacity can encode: large, dark, warm. The consistency is not explained by the confabulation hypothesis. Children confabulating from imagination or from stories do not produce consistent specific descriptions across independent cases. They produce idiosyncratic descriptions shaped by their individual exposure to stories and images. A child who has been told stories about bears describes a bear. A child exposed to stories about monsters describes a monster. A child confabulating from a frightening experience produces something shaped by their individual fears. The condition of children found alive in anomalous missing cases is one of the most carefully documented and least discussed aspects of Paulides' research. In cases where young children are recovered alive after periods that should have produced significant physical deterioration, hypothermia, dehydration, injury from terrain exposure, the physical condition of the recovered child is sometimes inconsistent with what the elapsed time and exposure conditions would produce. Children found after 2 days in wilderness conditions, showing temperatures and weather patterns that should produce hypothermia, who do not exhibit hypothermia. Children missing for 24 or 36 hours, who when found are not as hungry or thirsty as they should be. Children whose physical condition suggests a shorter exposure period than the documented time of disappearance indicates. These findings are noted in case files. They are not, in general, followed up. The official explanation in these cases is typically resilience, the remarkable capacity of the human body particularly in children, to withstand conditions that models would predict as fatal. This explanation is real. Children do survive conditions that models predict as unsurvivable. This accounts for some cases. It does not account for all of them. It does not account for the cases where the physical evidence is not simply at the survivable end of the normal distribution, but is inconsistent with the documented timeline in ways that suggest the exposure period was shorter than the documented missing period. If a child was missing for 40 hours and their physical condition suggests 12 hours of exposure, one of two things is true. Either the physical condition evidence is wrong, or the child was not exposed to wilderness conditions for 40 hours. The first possibility is the one that official findings default to. The second possibility, that the child was not in the wilderness during some portion of the documented missing period, is not a conclusion that any official investigation will state, but it is what the evidence, in some cases, actually suggests. Where was the child during the hours when they were not accumulating the physical evidence of exposure? This is the question that the children who survived sometimes answer. And their answers are the most difficult part of this research to engage with honestly. The accounts that surviving children give of the missing period are, as noted in an earlier episode, consistently dismissed as childhood fantasy, post-traumatic confabulation, or the natural storytelling behavior of young children who lack the cognitive framework to accurately encode and retrieve memory of distressing events. This dismissal is not unreasonable as a default response. Children do confabulate. Memory formation and retrieval in young children is unreliable in ways that are well documented in developmental psychology. A 3-year-old's account of what happened to them over 2 days in the wilderness should be treated with appropriate skepticism. But the skepticism should be applied consistently. It should not be deployed selectively to eliminate evidence that conflicts with the preferred explanation while accepting evidence that supports it. The accounts of surviving children in anomalous missing cases share specific characteristics across cases involving children who could not have known each other, who disappeared in different states, in different years, in different park systems. Large, dark, warm, strong, carrying them, moving with them, keeping them warm, not threatening, not frightening in the way that something threatening would be frightening. These descriptions are consistent across cases involving 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds, consistent in the specific details that a child's vocabulary and developmental capacity can encode. Large, dark, warm. The consistency is not explained by the confabulation hypothesis. Children confabulating from imagination or from stories do not produce consistent, specific descriptions across independent cases. They produce idiosyncratic descriptions shaped by their individual exposure to stories and images. A child who has been told stories about bears describes a bear. A child exposed to stories about monsters describes a monster. A child confabulating from a frightening experience produces something shaped by their individual fears. The children in these cases describe the same thing. Something that is not in their story vocabulary. Something that is not a bear or a wolf or a scary person. Something large and dark and warm that carried them. One child, recovered alive from a wilderness area in the Pacific Northwest after being missing for approximately 36 hours, told her parents when she was found that she had been with a big, dark, furry man who had kept her warm. She said he had carried her most of the time. She said he had put her down when she wanted to walk. She said he had left her in the place where she was found and gone back into the trees. She was 4 years old. She did not know what Bigfoot was. She had not been exposed to stories about large forest beings. She had no cultural framework for what she was describing. She described what she experienced: large, dark, warm, carrying her, leaving her. The official explanation of her recovery noted the child's statement and attributed it to childhood imagination. The case was closed. The traditions that have the most specific and most practically oriented framework for what happens to children in these circumstances are the Pacific Northwest coastal traditions: the Stensilers, the Lummi, the Tsimshian, the Tlingit, whose territories encompass some of the highest density cluster zones in Paulides' dataset. These traditions do not describe children being harmed in encounters with the forest beings. They describe something more complex than harm. They describe children being taken into a relationship with the non-human world that changes them. That the children who return from extended contact with the beings are changed in specific ways. That they carry something back with them: knowledge or perception, or a quality of relationship to the non-human world that was not present before the encounter. This is not a comfortable description for a parent whose child has been missing. It is not a description that official search and rescue agencies have any framework for engaging with. It requires a cosmological understanding of the relationship between the human world and the world alongside it that Western institutions simply do not have access to. But it is specific. It is consistent across multiple traditions in the same geographic zone, and it points towards something: that the pattern of child disappearances and recoveries in that zone makes more difficult to dismiss than it would otherwise be. The children are not harmed. Some of them are not returned. But those who are returned are not harmed. They are changed. They carry something back. What that something is, the traditions describe in terms of relationship and knowledge, and a particular quality of awareness that the child maintains throughout their life. Whether this is an accurate description of something that really happens to children who have genuinely been in proximity to the beings of the forest, whether the traditional knowledge is encoding real experience in the language of its cosmological framework, is not a question that can be answered from the outside. But the traditions are specific, and the cases are consistent with what the traditions describe. And the children, when they are found, are sometimes in better condition than they should be, and sometimes they describe being carried by something large and dark and warm. The institutional response to the child disappearance cases in Paulides' research is, if anything, more aggressively incurious than the institutional response to adult cases. This is understandable on one level. Cases involving missing children generate enormous public attention and emotional weight. Institutions managing those cases are under significant pressure to provide explanations that are emotionally tolerable. Explanations that acknowledge the possibility of something deeply outside normal parameters, something that accounts for the impossible distances and the inside-out clothing and the searched areas and the children who describe being carried, are not emotionally tolerable in the context of official case closure. So the official findings default to the available conventional explanations: predation, exposure, drowning, falls. The explanation that fits the category of case even when the specific evidence of the case does not support it. And the families are given closure that is not closure. Official findings that answer the formal question of cause of death, while leaving unanswered all the questions that actually matter to the people who loved the child. Where was Jaryd Atadero for the 4 years before his remains were found in a searched area in a location he could not have reached? Why was his clothing inside out? Where are his shoes? These questions are in the official record. They have not been answered. The case has been closed. Jaryd Atadero has been carrying these questions for 25 years. He will carry them for the rest of his life, because no institution that had the authority and the resources to investigate them honestly chose to do so. This is the cost of the institutional posture of not looking, not an abstraction. A father, 25 years, questions that should have been asked and followed and answered. The cost is real. The people who bear it are real, and the pattern that their case is a part of is still accumulating new cases in the same places, with the same characteristics, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. There is a quality to the accounts of children recovered in anomalous circumstances that is worth noting beyond the specific content of what they describe. It is the quality of certainty. Young children are, in general, not reliable narrators of their own experience. They confabulate. They conflate imagination and memory. They are susceptible to suggestion. Their accounts of events should be treated with appropriate developmental skepticism. But the children who describe being carried, who describe the large, dark, warm thing that held them during the missing period, describe it with a quality of certainty that developmental psychologists who have reviewed the accounts describe as unusual. They do not describe it with the tentativeness of uncertain memory. They do not describe it with the elaboration and inconsistency of confabulated narrative. They describe it with the flatness and specificity of direct sensory experience, the quality that characterizes genuine perceptual memory in children. The warmth, the smell, the movement, the specific sensory details that confabulation does not reliably produce. One developmental psychologist, reviewing a specific set of these accounts at a researcher's request, noted that the quality of certainty and sensory specificity in the descriptions was more consistent with genuine perceptual memory than with confabulation. She noted this carefully and with appropriate hedging. She did not conclude that the children had been carried by an unknown forest being. She concluded that the accounts had the phenomenological characteristics of real perceptual experience rather than invented narrative. What the children perceived, whatever the actual cause of the perception, was, in her professional assessment, something they actually experienced rather than something they imagined or were told. Something happened to those children during the missing period. Something large and dark and warm was part of what happened. The children know it, in the clear, certain, sensory-specific way that young children know the things they have actually experienced. And what they know has been quietly, persistently, institutionally ignored for as long as they have been describing it. The wilderness at night, when you are small and alone and separated from the people who should be protecting you, is one of the most frightening situations a human being can find themselves in. The cold, the dark, the sounds that are unfamiliar, the absence of the familiar voices and faces that mean safety, the complete removal from everything that the domestic world provides. For an adult, this situation is frightening and potentially fatal. For a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, the developmental capacity to manage it is simply not present. The fear alone, in the darkness, in the cold, should be overwhelming. The physical exposure, without shelter and warmth, should produce rapid deterioration. And yet some of these children are found in conditions that do not match the exposure they should have experienced. Some of them describe being warm. Some of them describe not being alone. The traditions of the people who have lived longest in the forests where these cases occur do not find this contradictory. They do not find the idea of the forest beings caring for a lost child surprising. It is consistent with how those traditions understand the beings, not predatory, not indifferent, present in the forest, with an awareness of what is happening in their territory, including the small humans who have become separated from their families. Whether the beings return the children because they choose to, or because of some obligation within the framework of how they understand their relationship to the human world, or for reasons that have no human equivalent, the traditions are not specific about the mechanism. They are specific about the outcome. The children who are found alive, in cases where the beings are involved, are found alive. Some of them remember warmth. Some of them remember being carried. Some of them, in their small voices, with their limited vocabulary and their certain sensory-specific descriptions, describe something that no institutional explanation has been willing to account for. Large, dark, warm, and gone when the searchers finally arrived. Back into the trees, back into the forest that has always been home, to whatever has always lived there, and waited there, and sometimes, perhaps, carried a small child through the night, keeping them warm, until it was time to put them down, and let them be found. The geographic distribution of child disappearance cases within Paulides' dataset correlates with the broader cluster pattern in ways that are specific enough to be informative. The Pacific Northwest Cluster, the Cascades, the Olympics, the Coast Range, produces a disproportionate share of the child cases. The Great Smoky Mountains, the Colorado Rockies, the Allegheny Plateau, the boreal forest zones of the Great Lakes region. These are not random distributions. They are the same geographic concentrations that appear in the broader dataset. The same drainages, the same elevation ranges, the same proximity to specific water configurations, the same relationship to the areas identified in indigenous traditions as threshold zones, the places where the membrane between the human world and the world alongside it is most accessible. Children disappear in the threshold zones at rates elevated above what would be predicted from simple visitor distribution. Children are found in impossible locations in the threshold zones. Children describe being carried in the threshold zones. The threshold zones are not evenly distributed across the wilderness. They are specific. They have been specific for as long as the traditions that describe them have existed. The Park Service does not track missing persons by park. It does not analyze the geographic distribution of cases with anomalous characteristics. It does not consult the traditional knowledge of the communities whose territories encompass the threshold zones. But the threshold zones are still there, and children are still disappearing in them, and some of them are still being found in conditions and locations that the conventional explanations cannot account for, and some of them still describe being warm when they should have been cold, being carried when they should have been alone, being put down gently, in a specific place, and waiting there until someone finally came. The case of Dennis Martin continues to be relevant not only for what it documents about a specific disappearance, but for what it documents about how official investigations handle evidence that does not fit their preferred explanations. Dennis was 6 years old when he disappeared from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on June 14, 1969. His disappearance was witnessed in the sense that he was last seen alive by multiple people in a specific location at a specific time. The search that followed was one of the most extensive in national park history. Green Berets were deployed. Hundreds of civilians searched. The Park Service committed significant resources over multiple days. Dennis was never found. The witness account that was not incorporated into the official investigation, the account from a family who reported seeing a large, dark figure moving through the forest, carrying what appeared to be a child, was reported to park officials at the time. It was not followed up. This decision, whatever its justification, had a specific effect. It removed from the investigative record the only potential eyewitness account of what happened to Dennis Martin after he disappeared from the trail. Whether the account was accurate cannot be determined. Whether it described Dennis Martin cannot be established. These are genuine epistemic limitations that any honest investigation would acknowledge. What is not an epistemic limitation is the decision not to investigate. The decision was made, the account was received and not pursued. And the reason for that decision, the specific determination that the account did not warrant investigative follow-up, is not in the public record. The family was told their son died of exposure. His remains were never found. The cause of death is an inference, not a determination based on physical evidence. Dennis Martin has been missing for 55 years. The account of the large, dark figure carrying a child through the Smoky Mountains forest in June of 1969 is in the memory of the family that reported it, and in the notes of the researchers who eventually located and interviewed them. It is not in the official record. These are not the same thing. There is a pattern in the child disappearance cases that Paulides documents that has received almost no attention in the broader discussion of his research. It is the pattern of what children do when they are found. Children who are found alive in standard lost person cases. Children who have been genuinely lost, wandering, exposed, alone, typically exhibit behaviors consistent with significant stress and with the physical effects of exposure. They are hungry and thirsty. They are cold. They are often injured from falls or from moving through rough terrain. They are overwhelmingly relieved to be found. They respond to familiar voices and faces with the intensity of a child who has been genuinely frightened and alone for an extended period. Children in anomalous recovery cases sometimes exhibit different behavioral patterns. They are sometimes calm in ways that are inconsistent with what the elapsed time and conditions should have produced. They are sometimes not hungry or thirsty to the degree expected. They sometimes do not respond to being found with the overwhelming relief that characterizes standard lost child recoveries. And some of them are reluctant to leave, not reluctant in the way of a traumatized child who cannot process what is happening, reluctant in a specific, directed way, looking back toward the trees or toward whatever landscape feature was nearest to where they were found, as if there is something there that they are not ready to leave. This behavioral detail appears in enough independent accounts that it cannot be attributed to coincidence or to the idiosyncratic behavior of individual children. It is consistent across cases involving children who had no contact with each other, who are found in different regions in different decades. The children look back. Whatever they experienced during the missing period, whatever was with them, whatever kept them warm, has left something behind in them. Not a trauma, something more like an attachment, a connection to whatever was in those trees that is not immediately broken by the arrival of the searchers and the parents and all the familiar elements of the human world. The traditions describe this, the change that contact with the beings produces, the quality that the children carry back with them, the ongoing connection to the non-human world that does not simply dissolve when the child returns to the human world. The children look back because something is still there, and they know it, in the specific, certain, sensory-specific way that young children know the things they have genuinely experienced. The broader question that the child disappearance cases force, the question that the evidence accumulates toward, regardless of how uncomfortable it is one that has not been stated directly in any official context, and that the research community has been cautious about stating even in its own literature. Is there something in the cluster zones that specifically interacts with young children? Not simply encounters with young children as part of a general pattern of interaction with all humans, but specific, targeted interaction with children in the 2 to 6 developmental range. Interaction that produces the elevated rate of disappearances in that age group within the anomalous case category. Interaction that, in the cases where children are returned, leaves them in better physical condition than the elapsed time and exposure would produce. Interaction that leaves them looking back at the tree line. This question is not answerable from the evidence currently available. The evidence suggests the question should be asked. It does not answer it, but it points in a direction that is consistent with what the traditions describe about the relationship between the forest beings and children, the specific attention that children receive, the change that contact produces, the ongoing quality of relationship that survives the return to the human world. The traditions have always known that children occupy a different relationship to the non-human world than adults do, that the membrane between the worlds is more permeable for children, that the beings of the forest have a specific kind of awareness of children that they do not have of adults, whether this is protective or predatory or something that has no adequate human category is not stated uniformly across traditions. The Pacific Northwest coastal traditions, as noted, tend toward protective descriptions. The Navajo and Cherokee traditions are more cautious. The interaction changes the child in ways that may not be entirely benign from the perspective of the child's ongoing participation in the human world. The traditions are not unanimous. They reflect the diversity of thousands of years of accumulated experience with phenomena that are genuinely complex, but they are all in agreement on one thing. The children who encounter the beings in the threshold zones are changed by the encounter. They come back different. They look back at the trees, and what they carry back with them stays with them for a long time, perhaps for the rest of their lives. The parents of the children who have disappeared in the cluster zones deserve a specific acknowledgement that official channels have not provided. They have been told in case after case that their child died in a way that the evidence does not fully support. They have been given cause of death determinations that close the official record while leaving the actual questions open. They have been denied access to the data that would allow them to understand their child's case in the context of the broader pattern, because that data is not compiled and not released. They carry their grief alongside unanswered questions that should have been investigated and were not. This is a specific harm, not the harm of the disappearance itself. Nothing can undo that harm, but the additional harm of being denied honest investigation, of being given explanations that function as administrative closure rather than genuine answers, of living with the knowledge that the system responsible for the land where their child disappeared has made a systematic decision not to look at the pattern that their child's case is part of. The research that Paulides has done is, in part, for these families. It is an attempt to see the pattern that the institutions will not see, to document what the institutions will not document, to ask the questions that the institutions will not ask. It does not provide answers. The questions that would produce answers require resources and authority that Paulides does not have, and that the institutions have declined to deploy. But it provides something: the recognition that the pattern is real, that the cases are not simply tragic accidents randomly distributed across the wilderness, that something consistent is happening in specific places with specific characteristics, that their children are not simply statistics in an unacknowledged data set, that they are part of a pattern that deserves honest investigation, that they deserved better than the institutional silence that has been the consistent response to what happened to them. They deserved investigators who were willing to look directly at the evidence, who were willing to ask the families of the Seat Sales and the Cherokee and the Lakota what they have always known about what happens in those places, who were willing to follow the pattern wherever it led. They did not get those investigators. The pattern is still there. The threshold zones are still there. The children who disappear in them are still disappearing. And whatever has been in those places since before the parks were established, since before the roads were built, since before the first European foot touched this continent, it is still there too, in the forest, in the threshold zones, where the water converges and the terrain changes and the dogs lose the trail, doing what it has always done, in the places it has always done it, and the children who encounter it carry something back from the encounter, something large and dark and warm, something that they felt in the darkness when they should have been alone and cold and frightened, something that kept them until it was time to put them down and go back into the trees, where it has always been, where it will always be, in the forests that were here before us and will be hereafter, long after all of us are done asking what was in them. There are details in the child disappearance cases that appear so consistently across independent cases that they have become, among researchers familiar with the full data set, a kind of checklist, a set of characteristics that, when they appear together, mark a case as anomalous in the specific sense that Paulides uses that word, the immediate vanish, the case where the child disappears in the time it takes an attentive parent to look away, not while the parent was occupied for minutes, not while the parent was engaged in a task that required sustained attention, in the time of a distraction measured in seconds. This characteristic is not consistent with a lost child. A 3-year-old walking away from their parent does not disappear in seconds. They walk. They can be seen walking. They can be called back. They can be followed. The immediate vanish, the child present 1 second and absent the next, is not explained by normal lost child mechanics. The dog failure. In nearly every anomalous child disappearance case in the dataset, tracking dogs deployed within a short time of the disappearance from a location with fresh scent find nothing. No trail, no direction. The specific failure mode of the immediate drop, where the dog works the last known location and finds nothing to follow, appears in case after case. This failure mode is not explained by standard tracking conditions. The cases are not characterized by conditions that degrade scent rapidly: heavy rain, extreme heat, contaminating traffic. The scent failure happens in conditions that should be ideal for tracking. In some cases, in conditions where the same dog successfully tracked other scent trails the same day. The impossible location. When the child is found, they are found in a location that the standard lost person behavior model does not predict. Not simply far from where they disappeared, far and in an unexpected direction, far and at an elevation or in a terrain type that the child's physical capabilities do not account for, far in an area that was searched before the child was found there. These 3 characteristics together, immediate vanish, dog failure, impossible location, define the core anomalous profile that distinguishes the cases Paulides identifies as requiring explanation from the cases that have conventional explanations. They appear together in the same cases in the cluster zones. They have been appearing together in the same cluster zones for as long as records have been kept, and they have not been explained. The question of what the inside-out clothing means is one that Paulides raises and that no official investigation has answered. The clothing is a physical fact. It is documented in case files. In the Jaryd Atadero case, it was explicit and undeniable. In other cases, it appears as a detail noted in evidence documentation and then not followed up. Clothing turned inside out on a body or in association with remains is not a normal finding in wilderness death cases. The mechanisms that produce death in wilderness conditions, exposure, predation, falls, do not turn clothing inside out. Weather does not turn clothing inside out. Decomposition processes do not turn clothing inside out. Something turned that clothing inside out. Something with the manual capability to manipulate clothing, with the awareness that clothing is a category of object, with a reason, whatever that reason was, to turn it inside out on a small child. The possible explanations are limited. A human being turned it inside out. Something that is not a human being but has comparable manual capability turned it inside out. Or the clothing was already inside out when the child was dressed, and this detail has no significance. The third possibility is the simplest and should be exhausted before proceeding to the others. In the Atadero case, it was not exhausted. The family confirmed that Jaryd was properly dressed when he left. The clothing was not inside out when he was last seen, which leaves the first 2 possibilities. A human being with access to Jaryd Atadero's body at some point during the 4 years between his disappearance and the discovery of his remains turned his clothing inside out. No human being with that access has been identified. The investigation that would have identified such a person was not conducted. Something else turn the clothing inside out, something with the manual capability to do so, in a location that had been searched. In terrain a 3-year-old could not have reached unassisted. The evidence points toward the second possibility, not because the first is impossible, but because the first has not been supported by any investigation, and because the second is consistent with the other anomalous characteristics of the case. It is not a comfortable conclusion. It is what the evidence suggests, and it has not been addressed. In the official record, the clothing was inside out, and that fact has no explanation. It is simply there, like so many other facts in these cases, present in the record, unaddressed, waiting for someone to ask what they mean. There is an elder from a coastal Pacific Northwest nation. The specific nation has been withheld at his request, who has spoken to researchers about what his tradition knows regarding children and the forest beings. He is in his 80s. He grew up in a time when the oral traditions were still transmitted in a relatively intact form, before the specific pressures that would later fragment many of the transmission chains had fully taken hold. He knows things that fewer and fewer people living know. He was asked specifically about children, about what the tradition says regarding children who are taken by the beings and later returned. He was quiet for a time before answering. Then he said, "The beings are not our enemies. They have never been our enemies. They were here before us, and they will be here after us, and they know things about this land that we have forgotten. When they take a child, it is not the way a predator takes prey. It is more like," he paused, looking for the word, "it is more like an adoption, a temporary adoption. The child is being shown something, being given something, being held in the knowledge of what this land actually is before the human world fully closes around them." He said, "Not all children come back. This is true, and it is terrible. But the ones who come back, they carry something. They are different in specific ways for the rest of their lives, more aware of the non-human world, more able to perceive things that other people do not perceive, more connected to the land in a way that is felt before it is understood." He said, "In our tradition, when a child was taken and returned, we did not treat the return as simply a recovery. We treated it as a beginning. The child had been initiated into a relationship with the beings. The child would carry that relationship for the rest of their life. We had ceremonies for this. We had protocols for how the community related to a returned child, for how the returned child was taught to understand and manage what they now carried." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Those ceremonies and protocols are mostly lost now. The children who come back in your time have no framework for what happened to them. They are given explanations that do not explain anything. They are treated as if what happened to them was simply a frightening experience that they should recover from and move on. They are not given the knowledge of what they actually are now." He said, "That is a loss, not just for the children, for the whole community of beings, human and otherwise, that shares this land." He looked at the researcher for a long time. Then he said, "The children know something. They always know it. They carry it their whole lives, even if no one ever tells them what it is." He said, "Some of them find their way to it anyway, on their own, in the forest, without anyone to guide them." He said, "The beings wait for that, for the ones who find their way back." He looked toward the window and the trees beyond it. Then he said, They are very patient. There is a question that sits at the end of everything documented in this episode, a question that the evidence accumulates toward, and that no official voice has been willing to ask, and that every parent of a missing child has been asking in one form or another since the day their child disappeared. Where did they go? Not the administrative answer, not the cause of death determination, not the official finding that closes the file. Where did they go? The children who vanished in seconds from their parents' sight. The children whose trails the dogs could not find. The children found in impossible locations, in searched areas. The children found in better condition than the exposure should have produced. The children who describe being warm, being carried, being put down and left by something large and dark and warm that went back into the trees. Where did they go? The traditions that have the most experience with this question, the people who have lived longest in the places where the children disappear, give an answer that Western institutions do not have a framework for. They went to the threshold. They were taken by something that lives at the threshold. They were held in the space between the human world and the world alongside it for the duration of the missing period. And then some of them were returned, and some of them were not. The ones who were returned carry something back. The ones who were not are in a place that the threshold opens onto, a place that the traditions have names for, and that Western science does not. This is not the answer that official investigations provide. It is not an answer that satisfies the administrative requirements of case closure or that fits within the frameworks that emergency management agencies use to organize their response to wilderness incidents. But it is the answer that the accumulated evidence of hundreds of cases, examined honestly, without the prior commitment to conventional explanation that official investigations require, points toward, not conclusively, not provably, but consistently. The pattern points toward the threshold. The traditions point toward the threshold. The children, in their certain sensory-specific, warm and carried descriptions, point toward the threshold, and the threshold is in the cluster zones, in the drainages and the boulder fields and the water convergence zones and all the other specific places where the pattern has been writing itself for as long as the wilderness has existed, where something ancient and present and aware has been living since before the first human child walked into the forest, and where sometimes a small child walks in too close to the edge of what the human world can hold, and encounters what is on the other side of it, and comes back changed, or does not come back at all. The children deserve honest investigation into what happened to them. Their parents deserve honest investigation into what happened to their children. The wilderness deserves honest investigation into what it contains, and whatever lives at the threshold deserves to be understood, not captured, not proven, not displayed, but understood, with the patience and the respect and the specific kind of attention that the traditions that have lived alongside it have always brought to the relationship. The children went to the threshold. Some of them came back. They looked back at the trees when the searchers finally came. They are looking still, in whatever forest is nearest to wherever they are now, at the edge of the tree line, where the human world ends, and something very old begins. The elder from the coastal nation said the beings are very patient. They have been waiting for 10,000 years for human beings to understand the relationship. They are still waiting. And in the threshold zones, in the specific drainages and the boulder fields and the water convergence zones, where the pattern has always concentrated, they are still doing what they have always done, holding what the human world loses at the edge, keeping it warm, until it is time, or until it is not, and in either case, going back into the trees, where they have always been, and will always be, in the forest that was here before the children, and will be here long after all of us are done asking where they went. Alfred Beilhartz would be 89 years old now if he were alive. Jaryd Atadero would be 28. Dennis Martin would be 61. They are not ages. They are the space where ages should have been. The threshold took them, and the threshold has not given them back. And nobody with the authority to ask why has ever fully asked. The forest keeps its record. The pattern is still there, and the threshold is still exactly where it has always been, waiting, as it has always waited, for the honest question and the honest investigation that follows it.